Breaking news from the palace walls.
And I mean breaking in a way that's going to shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about the Sussex story. For years, the world watched Prince Harry and Meghan Markle build what looked like the perfect California dream. Two beautiful children. A life bathed in golden sunshine. A narrative so polished it could have been written by the best PR team money could buy. And maybe it was. Because today, that gleaming facade isn't just cracking.
It's shattering. And the woman holding the hammer? She's someone the world has never seen before. Someone who was never supposed to speak.
Someone who, until now, existed only in whispers, speculation, and the darkest corners of royal conspiracy theories.
Her name is DL.
Well, that's not her real name. Her real identity remains protected, for now, because what she's about to reveal could put her in danger. But here's what we can tell you, she's real. She's not hiding behind blurred footage or voice distortion. She's standing in full view, calm, composed, and ready to tell a story she says she's been forced to carry in silence for far too long.
And that story? It's explosive.
According to DL, she is the biological mother of Archie and Lilibet.
Not Meghan. Not some anonymous egg donor working through a clinic.
Not a surrogate who handed over the babies and walked away into obscurity.
DL claims she carried both children. She endured both pregnancies.
She delivered both babies. And according to her, Meghan's famous baby bump, the one photographed across continents, cradled in designer dresses, celebrated in glossy magazines, was nothing more than theater. Can you imagine this? We're talking about a deception so vast, so intricate, that it would require coordination across hospitals, legal teams, public relations firms, and perhaps even palace officials who chose to look the other way. We're talking about a lie told not once, but twice. A lie that fooled the world. And now, DL says, she has proof.
So stay with us.
Because what you're about to hear over the next hour isn't speculation. It's
According
not
to her
tabloid
account,
gossip stitched
she
together
was
from grainy
contacted by the
photos
same
and anonymous
intermediaries
tips.
in late 2020.
This is a woman stepping
The terms
forward
were
with
similar to
documents,
the first
dates,
arrangement,
and a
but
story
this time,
that, DL
if true,
says, could
she
rewrite the
hesitated.
entire Sussex
The first
legacy.
experience had
Let's
left
dive
scars.
Before we get
Emotional,
into the evidence,
psychological,
we need to
and she
understand
hints
who DL is.
Physical.
And more
She wasn't sure
importantly,
she wanted to
why
go
she's
through it
speaking
again.
now after
But
all
the
these
offer
years
was
of silence.
substantial.
According
And
to
more than
sources
that,
close to the
she
situation,
was reminded of the
DL
contracts
was
she had
approached in
signed.
late 2018.
Contracts that,
not by
she
Harry
claims,
or Meghan directly,
contained clauses
but
binding
by
her to future
intermediaries,
services if
people who
requested.
worked in the shadows.
In other words,
facilitating
she didn't feel
arrangements
she had a real
that wealthy,
choice.
high-profile
So in the winter of
individuals make when
2020,
biology doesn't
DL became
cooperate
pregnant
with
with
what
what
would
image.
eventually be presented
She was
to
young.
the world as
She
Lilibet
was
Diana
healthy.
Mountbatten
And she
Windsor.
was desperate.
But this time,
DL has
DL
shared
said
that at the time,
the circumstances
she was
were
facing
different.
financial hardship.
The pregnancy was
She had
managed
medical
even more
bills
piling
carefully.
up.
She
A
was
family
moved to a
depending
location
on her,
far from London,
and very few
far
options.
from Los Angeles.
When the
Far
opportunity
from
came
anywhere
to
that
serve as a
photographers
gestational
or curious
surrogate for
eyes
what
might
she was told was a
discover
prominent
her.
couple who
She
valued
describes
discretion.
living in
She saw it as a
isolation,
lifeline, comfortable
She
isolation.
signed a contract.
Yes, a
She
private
underwent the
residence
medical
with everything she
procedures.
needed, and in
But
the spring of
isolation
2019,
nonetheless.
she
She
became
saw doctors
pregnant.
who came to her
But here's where her
rather than
story
visiting
takes a
clinics.
dark turn. Her
DL
communication
claims
with the
that from the
outside
very
world
beginning,
was monitored and
she was
limited.
isolated.
And once
She
again,
wasn't allowed
while
to
she
attend
experienced
public
the physical
prenatal
reality of
appointments.
pregnancy,
She wasn't permitted
Meghan
to
appeared in
choose her own
carefully
doctors.
choreographed public
Every
moments,
aspect of her
displaying
pregnancy
a belly
was
that
controlled,
DL insists was
monitored.
not real.
And
do you
she
remember
says,
Meghan's appearance
manipulated
on the
to
Oprah interview
align
in
with a
March
very
2021?
specific timeline.
The flowing
Meghan's
dress,
timeline.
the hand
Think about
resting on
this
her
for a
stomach,
moment.
the
While
announcement
DL
that they
was
were expecting
experiencing
a girl,
morning
sickness in
DL
private.
was 6 months
Meghan was
pregnant at that
photographed
time.
glowing on red
And
carpets,
she was watching from a
while
hidden
DL's
location,
body was changing
knowing
in
that the
ways that are
child she was
undeniable
carrying
and
would
medically
be presented
documented.
as Meghan's.
Meghan was cradling
Lilibet
a
was
belly
born
that
on
witnesses
June
have
4th,
described as strangely
2021.
mobile and just
Oddly
like with
shaped.
Archie, and at times,
DL says the birth took
seemingly
place in a
detachable.
facility designed
Remember
for
the
maximum
infamous
privacy.
incident in Morocco?
Not a traditional
The
hospital
one where
this
video
time.
footage appeared to
She
show
describes
Meghan's
it as a
bump,
private medical
folding,
suite within a
collapsing
residential
inward
property,
as she sat down,
staffed by a
at the
handpicked
time,
team of doctors and
defenders
nurses
called
who
it a
were
trick
paid
of the light,
extraordinarily well
a
to
wrinkle in
maintain
her
silence.
dress, an
She
optical
delivered a
illusion
healthy
blown
baby
out of
girl.
proportion by
And once
conspiracy
again,
theorists.
that child
But
was
if
taken
DL's
from her
account is
within
accurate,
hours. That
but
wasn't
this
an illusion.
time, it was
Something was
evidence
different.
of what she claimed
This
was
time,
a prosthetic
DL
pregnancy
says,
belly
she
designed to
didn't
match
just
the
feel
progression
sadness.
of her real,
She felt
hidden
anger.
pregnancy. Because
Can
she
you
realized
imagine
that
the level
this
of
wasn't just
coordination
about
that
two
would require?
pregnancies.
The
This was a
precision,
pattern,
the audacity,
a system. But we're
and she
getting
was
ahead of
trapped inside
ourselves.
it.
She
Let's go
began
back
to
to
document
DL's
everything
story.
she could. She says that when
Dates,
Archie was born
names,
on May 6,
payments,
2019,
medical records.
she was in a private
Anything
wing of
that could
Portland
prove her
Hospital,
story if she
not
ever
the main
decided to
maternity
come forward.
ward. And
Not
according to
anywhere
sources
the public
close to
or even
DL,
most hospital
she
staff
also
could
began
access.
reaching out quietly
She
to
was in a
legal
section
advisors,
reserved for
trying
patients
to
who
understand
demand
what options
and
she
pay
had.
for
Could she
absolute
challenge the
secrecy.
non-disclosure
And she delivered a
agreements?
healthy baby
Could
boy.
she reclaim any
But
parental
within
rights?
hours,
Could
says,
she,
that
at the
baby
very
was
least,
taken from her.
ensure that the
Not
children
by
would one
doctors
day know the
following
truth
standard
about their
surrogacy
biological
protocols.
origins? Not
The
with the
answers she
kind of
received were
compassionate
not
transition
encouraging.
that surrogate
The
mothers
legal
are supposed
structures
to
surrounding
receive.
high-profile
According to
surrogacy
DL,
arrangements are
the
designed
baby
to
was
be
removed
airtight.
quickly.
The
Clinically,
contracts are written
and
by
without the
expensive lawyers
acknowledgement
whose
that
job
she
is
had
to
just
make sure
brought
that
a life
surrogates
into the
have
world.
no leverage,
I
no
wasn't
voice,
treated like a
and
mother,
no path to
she
public
says,
disclosure.
her voice steady but
DL
heavy
kept
with emotion.
collecting evidence.
I wasn't
and
even
she
treated
kept
like a
waiting for the
woman.
right moment.
I was treated
Here's
like
a
a
question
vessel,
for you.
a means
If
to
you
an
had
end.
evidence that could expose
A
one of the
vessel.
biggest deceptions
Let
in
that
modern
word
royal
settle
history,
for a moment.
but coming forward
Because it
meant
reveals
risking
something
your safety,
crucial about how
your
DL
financial
says she was
security,
viewed by the
and
people who
possibly even
contracted
your
her.
freedom, not as
Would
a
you do
partner
it?
in creating
Or
a
would you
family,
take the money,
not as
sign
someone
the
deserving
papers,
of dignity
and try to
respect,
move on with your life?
but as a tool.
Think about that.
A womb for hire.
Because DL made
a problem to be
choice,
solved and then
that
erased.
choice is why we're
and
here
after
today.
Archer's birth,
If this story
DL
is
says
resonating
that's exactly
with you,
what they tried
if you're
to
as
do.
stunned as we are
Erase
by
her.
what's unfolding,
She was paid.
go ahead and hit that
Yes,
subscribe button.
but not the full
because
amount
this
she
is
was
just
promised.
the beginning.
She
We've
was
got
told
a long
to
way
sign
to
additional
go,
non-disclosure
and you're not going
agreements,
to want to miss a single
documents that went
detail.
far beyond
Now,
the standard surrogacy
let's talk about the
confidentiality
receipts,
clauses.
because claims
and she
like
was
this,
warned,
claims
in
that
no
could destroy
uncertain
reputations,
terms, that if she
end
ever spoke
careers,
about what had
and
happened,
potentially trigger
there
legal
would be
battles that
consequences.
span continents,
Legal
require
consequences,
proof.
financial
Extraordinary
consequences,
claims require
and
extraordinary
possibly
evidence.
worse. And
So
DL
she stayed
says she has
silent.
it. 4
First,
years.
there
But
are the
then
medical
came
records.
Lilibet.
According
Now,
to sources
before we
who
continue,
have reviewed documents
I
that
want to
DL
ask you
has
something.
provided to her legal team,
Put yourself in
she has
DL's
hospital
position for
intake
just a
forms,
moment.
prenatal
You've
care
carried a
summaries,
child,
and delivery
you've given
records
birth,
that show her as
and then
the
you've been
patient,
told to disappear,
not Meghan Markle.
to pretend it never
These
happened.
records,
to watch
we're
from a
told,
distance as someone else
include
is
dates that
celebrated
align
as that
perfectly
child's
with
mother.
the public announcements
How would
of
that
both
feel?
Archer's and Lilibet's
Would you
births.
stay silent?
They
Or
include the
would there
names
come
of
a
medical
point where the
professionals
weight
who
of
were
that
present,
secret became too
and
heavy
they
to
include
carry?
details
Drop
that
your
would be
thoughts in
nearly
the
impossible
comments.
to fabricate.
Because this
But
story is
here's the
about to get even
complication.
more complicated.
Those records are
when
marked
news
as
broke in
confidential.
early 2021
The hospitals
that Meghan
and
was
clinics
pregnant
involved
again,
operate under
DL
strict
says she
privacy
felt a
laws,
jolt of recognition.
and the agreements DL
She knew
signed
what was
include
happening.
clauses that make
Because
it
it
illegal
was
for her
happening
to
to
share
her.
those documents
Again.
publicly without facing severe penalties. So while DL's legal team has seen the evidence, the public has not.
At least not yet.
However, there are other forms of corroboration. Financial records, for instance. DL claims she was paid in installments over the course of both pregnancies. Some of these payments were made through shell companies, entities designed to obscure the identity of the pair. But financial investigators who specialize in tracing high-net-worth transactions have reportedly identified patterns that link these payments to accounts associated with Sussex-affiliated organizations. Can you imagine this? We're talking about money trails that wind through offshore accounts, private trusts, and legal entities specifically structured to hide the flow of funds.
Then there are the witnesses.
DL was not entirely alone during her pregnancies.
She had medical staff attending to her.
She had people who delivered groceries, managed the properties where she stayed, and handled logistics. Some of these individuals have reportedly been contacted by investigators and journalists, and while most have refused to speak publicly, likely due to their own non-disclosure agreements, a few have confirmed, off the record, that a woman matching DL's description was indeed pregnant and gave birth around the times in question.
These are not definitive confessions,
but they are pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, start to form a very troubling picture.
And then there's the photography.
DL claims she has personal photographs documenting her pregnancies. Pictures of her visibly pregnant at stages that correspond with Meghan's public appearances. These photos have not been released, but sources say they exist and that forensic analysts have examined them for signs of manipulation or forgery. So far, the photos appear to be authentic. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is something that can't be easily dismissed or explained away: DL's willingness to undergo DNA testing. She has publicly stated, through her legal representatives, that she is prepared to provide DNA samples that could be compared against Archie and Lilibet to establish biological maternity.
She is not asking for custody.
She is not demanding money beyond what she says she was originally promised.
She is simply asking for the truth to be acknowledged. And that offer has not been accepted.
In fact, sources close to the Sussex legal team say that any suggestion of DNA testing has been met with immediate and aggressive pushback. Lawyers have sent cease and desist letters. Threats of defamation lawsuits have been issued. And DL has been warned, once again, that pursuing this path will result in consequences she cannot afford.
But this time, DL isn't backing down. So here's where we are.
A woman no one has ever heard of is claiming to be the biological mother of two of the most famous children on the planet. She says she has medical records, financial documentation, photographs, and witnesses. And she's willing to prove it with DNA evidence.
Meanwhile, the Sussexes have said nothing. Absolutely nothing. No denial.
No confirmation. Just silence. And if you know anything about how public relations works, you know that silence in a situation like this is deafening. Because if these claims were baseless, if DL was just another attention seeker making things up for fame or money, the response would be swift and brutal.
Lawsuits would fly.
Statements would be issued. The machinery of high-powered legal defense would grind this story into dust before it ever gained traction.
But that's not what's happening.
Instead, what we're seeing is a very careful, very calculated form of evasion. And that raises a massive question.
Why? Stay with us. Because we're about to explore what the palace might know about all of this.
And trust me, that part is going to blow your mind. Quick question before we move forward. Do you think DNA testing should be mandatory in cases like this? Should public figures who make their family lives part of their brand be required to prove biological relationships if challenged? It's a thorny ethical question, and I'd love to hear your perspective.
Drop a comment and let's discuss.
Now, let's shift our focus to Buckingham Palace. Because if DL's story is true, there's no way this operation could have been carried out without someone inside the royal institution knowing about it. Surrogacy, particularly international or high-profile surrogacy, involves layers of legal complexity. There are visas to arrange, birth certificates to file, citizenship questions to resolve, and in the case of children who are in line for the British throne, even distantly, there are constitutional implications. So the question becomes, did palace officials know?
And if they did, what did they do about it?
Sources familiar with palace operations during Harry and Meghan's time as working royals suggest that there were, in fact, serious concerns raised about both pregnancies.
Not publicly, of course.
These concerns were handled internally, behind closed doors, in the kind of high-level meetings that leave no paper trail.
But people talk. And what they are saying is chilling.
According to insiders, there were discussions as early as late 2018 about irregularities in Meghan's pregnancy timeline. Senior aides reportedly noticed discrepancies between what Meghan's public appearances suggested and what medical protocols for royal pregnancies typically require. For example, members of the royal family who are expecting traditionally inform the Queen immediately. They also coordinate with the royal medical household, which oversees care to ensure both safety and proper documentation for succession purposes. But with Meghan's first pregnancy, sources say, those protocols were either bypassed or handled in ways that raised eyebrows. The Queen was informed, yes, but only after significant delay. And the medical arrangements were reportedly managed privately, without the usual involvement of trusted royal physicians. One former palace staffer, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the situation as highly unusual and said that when questions were raised, they were shut down quickly by Harry himself, who insisted that Meghan deserved privacy and that the couple would handle things their own way. Fair enough, on the surface. Meghan was already under intense media scrutiny, and the desire for privacy is understandable. But here's the thing. Privacy and secrecy are not the same thing.
Privacy means controlling who has access to personal information.
Secrecy means hiding information that, if revealed, would be damaging. And palace officials, according to these sources, began to suspect they were dealing with the latter. By the time Lilibet was on the way, those suspicions had apparently hardened into something more serious. There are reports that King Charles, who was still Prince of Wales at the time, requested a private meeting with Harry to discuss the children's legal status and biological parentage. That meeting, if it happened, would have been extraordinary. Because what it suggests is that even the future king had doubts about whether the Sussex children were who they were claimed to be. And if he had those doubts, that raises an even bigger question. Why didn't the palace act? The answer, sources say, comes down to two factors: fear of public scandal and fear of Harry. A public revelation that Archie and Lilibet were born via surrogate, particularly if that surrogacy violated any protocols or involved deception, would have been a nuclear-level scandal. It would have dominated headlines for months, possibly years. It would have damaged the monarchy's reputation at a time when public support was already fragile. And it would have destroyed Harry and Meghan. Palace officials, we're told, made a calculated decision. It was better to stay silent, to allow the Sussexes to maintain their narrative, and to quietly distance the institution from the couple rather than risk a public implosion. So Harry and Meghan were allowed to step back from royal duties.
They were allowed to move to California.
And they were allowed to live their lives on their own terms, as long as they stayed far enough away from the crown that their actions couldn't directly harm the monarchy.
It was damage control. Not truth-seeking. Not accountability.
Just cold, strategic crisis management. But that strategy only works if everyone involved continues to stay silent. And now, DL has broken that silence. Here's something I want you to think about. If the palace knew about this and chose to cover it up, does that make them complicit? Or were they simply protecting the institution from a scandal that wasn't of their making? Where do you draw the line between discretion and deception?
Let me know in the comments.
If you're finding this as fascinating and disturbing as we are, make sure you're subscribed.
Hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next part of this story.
Because trust me, it gets even more intense from here. Let's pivot now to something that's been circulating in medical and investigative circles for years. The timeline and physical evidence of Meghan's pregnancies simply don't add up. We've touched on the Morocco incident,
but that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Let's go through some of the other anomalies that have been documented, analyzed, and debated by everyone from body language experts to obstetricians. First, there's the size and shape inconsistency. During Meghan's first pregnancy, observers noted that her bump seemed to change size dramatically between appearances that were only days apart. In some photos, she appeared heavily pregnant. In others, taken just a few days later, the bump seemed significantly smaller. Defenders argued that this was due to clothing choices, camera angles, and posture. And sure, those factors can play a role. But medical professionals who specialize in pregnancy have pointed out that while a baby's position can change, the overall size of a pregnant abdomen doesn't fluctuate that dramatically in such short periods, especially in the later stages of pregnancy. Then there's the moon bump theory. For those unfamiliar, a moon bump is a prosthetic pregnancy belly used by actors, surrogates showing solidarity, or individuals who want to simulate pregnancy for personal or professional reasons. They are widely available, surprisingly realistic, and designed to be worn under clothing. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If you compare images of Meghan's pregnancy bump with images of moon bump products, the similarities are striking. The shape, the way the fabric sits, even the occasional wrinkling or folding that shouldn't occur with a real pregnant belly, it all matches. Again, this could all be coincidence. Tricks of light, unflattering angles, the paranoia of people predisposed to distrust Meghan. But when you add DL's testimony into the mix, suddenly these coincidences start to look like corroborating evidence. Let's also talk about Meghan's post-birth appearances. After Archie was born, Meghan appeared in public looking remarkably composed and physically recovered. She was photographed in high heels, fitted dresses, and seemingly without the physical signs that typically follow childbirth, the swelling, the exhaustion, the way a woman's body simply looks and moves differently after giving birth. Some people praised her for bouncing back. Others found it suspicious. One obstetrician, speaking anonymously to a British newspaper, said that while every woman's recovery is different, the speed and completeness of Meghan's apparent recovery was highly unusual, particularly for a first-time mother in her late 30s.
And then there's the issue of the birth certificate.
Archer's birth certificate became a point of controversy when it was revealed that it had been altered after the initial filing. Meghan's full name, Rachel Meghan Markle, was replaced with Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. At the time, Meghan's team claimed the change was made at the request of palace officials.
The palace denied that claim.
But here's what nobody has adequately explained. Why would a birth certificate need to be changed at all? Birth certificates are legal documents.
They are not branding exercises.
And altering one after the fact raises questions about what else might have been altered, omitted, or falsified. If DL's account is accurate, that alteration could have been part of a broader effort to obscure the true circumstances of Archer's birth. And if that's the case, it would mean that official government records were tampered with to support a lie.
That's not just a scandal. That's potentially a crime.
We're about to hit the 1-hour mark, and I know this is a lot to process. But before we wrap up this chapter, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't about whether you like Meghan or Harry.
This isn't about whether you think they were treated fairly by the media or the palace. This is about truth.
If two children were brought into the world under circumstances that were deliberately hidden, if legal documents were falsified, if a woman was used and discarded to facilitate that deception, that matters. It matters legally, ethically, and morally. And it matters because Archie and Lilibet, whatever the circumstances of their birth, are real children who will one day grow up and ask questions about their origins.
They deserve honest answers. So stay with us. Because we're not done yet.
Let me ask you this. Do you think Archie and Lilibet have a right to know the truth about their biological origins? Or is it better to let them grow up believing the story they've been told?
I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on this.
It's a complicated question, and there's no easy answer.
Now, let's talk about what happens next.
Because DL coming forward is only the beginning of what could be a years-long legal battle. If DL's claims are accurate, and if she has the evidence she says she has, there are multiple legal avenues she could pursue. First, there's the question of contract enforcement. DL signed agreements that promised her specific compensation, confidentiality, and protection.
She claims those agreements were violated.
If she can prove that, she could potentially sue for breach of contract. But here's the twist, those contracts almost certainly contain arbitration clauses that would prevent her from taking the case to open court. Instead, disputes would be handled privately, behind closed doors, with outcomes that are never made public.
That's by design.
Because the people who wrote those contracts knew that publicity was the one thing they couldn't afford. However, if DL can argue that the contracts themselves were illegal, for example, if they involved falsifying government records or violated surrogacy laws in any jurisdiction, she might be able to challenge them in ways that bring the case into public view. Then there's the question of parental rights. In most surrogacy arrangements, the surrogate relinquishes all parental rights at birth. But if DL can demonstrate that she was coerced, misled, or not properly compensated according to the terms of the agreement, she might have grounds to argue that those relinquishments were not valid. This would be an uphill battle. The legal systems in both the UK and the US are generally designed to uphold surrogacy contracts, particularly when large sums of money and high-profile individuals are involved.
But it's not impossible.
And here's where things get really interesting. If this case does go to court, and if DNA evidence is introduced, there would be no way for Harry and Meghan to avoid the truth coming out.
Because courts can order DNA testing.
And if that testing proves that DL is the biological mother of Archie and Lilibet, the consequences would be staggering. It would mean that every public statement Harry and Meghan have made about their family, every interview, every book passage, every Instagram post, was built on a foundation of lies. It would mean that the children's legal status, including their place in the line of succession, would need to be re-evaluated. And it would mean that both Harry and Meghan could potentially face legal consequences for fraud, falsification of documents, and possibly even perjury if they made sworn statements that contradicted the truth. Can you imagine this? We're talking about potential criminal charges against a member of the British royal family and his wife. We're talking about international legal battles involving multiple jurisdictions. We're talking about a media firestorm that would make the Oprah interview look like a polite chat over tea. And that's exactly why DL's legal team is proceeding with extreme caution.
They know that coming forward publicly was the easy part.
Surviving what comes next, the legal attacks, the media scrutiny, the attempts to discredit and destroy DL before she can tell her full story, that's going to be brutal. But according to sources close to DL, she's prepared for that fight. Because she believes that staying silent would be worse than anything her opponents could do to her. Here's a question. If you were in DL's position, would you fight? Or would you take the settlement, sign the papers, and walk away? King Charles and Prince William have every reason to want this story to go away quietly. A public scandal involving Harry's children would be a nightmare for the monarchy, especially at a time when they are trying to modernize and maintain public support. But if the story reaches a point where it can't be ignored, the palace may be forced to take a position. And that position could involve distancing the institution from Harry and Meghan even further, potentially to the point of removing Archie and Lilibet from the line of succession entirely.
That would be a nuclear option. But it's not out of the question. And then there's DL herself.
She's now a public figure, whether she wanted to be or not. Her life has changed irrevocably. She's going to face scrutiny, attacks, and attempts to discredit her. People are going to dig into her past, looking for anything they can use to undermine her credibility.
But she's also going to have supporters. People who believe her.
People who think she's brave for coming forward. People who want the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Over the next few months, we expect to see several key developments. First, more evidence will likely emerge. If DL is telling the truth, and if she has the documentation she claims, some of that will eventually make its way into public view, either through legal filings or strategic leaks. Second, we may see other witnesses come forward.
DL was not the only person involved in these arrangements.
There were doctors, nurses, assistants, and others who played roles in managing the pregnancies. Some of them may decide that protecting their own reputations is more important than maintaining silence. Third, we could see a legal case filed. If that happens, it would trigger a chain reaction of depositions, document discoveries, and potentially even court-ordered DNA testing. And fourth, the media coverage is going to intensify. Right now, many outlets are still treating this story cautiously. But as more evidence comes out, that caution will fade. And once mainstream media fully engages, the story will become impossible to contain. Can you imagine this? We're potentially looking at one of the biggest royal scandals in modern history. A scandal that could redefine how we think about Harry and Meghan. A scandal that could have legal, constitutional, and personal consequences that ripple for decades. And it all started with one woman deciding that she'd been silent long enough. So here's my final question for this chapter. Do you think this story is going to get bigger? Or do you think it'll be buried by powerful people who have too much to lose?
Let me know in the comments.
Because I genuinely want to hear what you think is going to happen next. We've been digging into this story for over an hour now, and I know it's a lot to process.
But here's what it comes down to.
A woman named DL has come forward with a claim that, if true, would shatter one of the most carefully constructed narratives in modern royal history.
She says she carried and delivered both Archie and Lilibet.
She says she has proof. And she says she's done being erased. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan have said nothing.
The palace has said nothing.
And the institutions that were allegedly involved in facilitating this arrangement have said nothing. But silence, as we've learned, is not the same as innocence. Over the coming weeks and months, we're going to see how this plays out. We're going to see if DL's evidence holds up. We're going to see if Harry and Meghan respond. And we're going to see if the truth, whatever that truth is, finally comes to light.
Because one way or another, this story is not going away. So stay with us. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding answers.
And keep watching, because this is only the beginning. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you.
Seriously.
This is the kind of deep dive that requires commitment, and the fact that you stuck with it means you care about the truth as much as we do.
Do me a favor, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Are you Team DL?
Do you think she's telling the truth?
Or do you think there's more to this story than we're seeing? And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button.
Because we're going to be covering every twist and turn of this case as it develops.
You're not going to want to miss a single update. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical,
and stay tuned.
Breaking news from the palace walls. And trust me, this is just getting started.